The rope creaked in the cold, a sharp, unnatural sound against the hush of falling snow. It wasn't the sound of branches or the wind, it was tighter, crueler. Suspended just above the ground, her wrists bound high to a bent limb of pine, the girl swayed slightly in the hush of the forest. Her feet, bare and purple with cold, didn't quite touch the snow. She wasn't struggling anymore. John Merritt saw her long before he allowed himself to believe it. At first, it looked like a shadow twisted in the storm, something half-formed between tree and ghost. But as he stepped off the ridge, lowering the reins of his mule and adjusting the old rifle slung across his back, the shape took form. It was a womana, young one-hung, not by the neck, but the arms, tied high in a way that stretched her thin frame cruelly. She was still breathing, barely. Her head lolled sideways. A ribbon of black hair clung to her cheek. One eye was open just enough to catch the light. The snow had been falling for hours. The forest was half swallowed by it. Ribbons of mist curled through the ponderosa, and the trail that led from Holbrook had long since disappeared. There was no town nearby, no ranches but his, no one else for miles. John didn't move at first. He stood in the stillness, watching her, the wind snapping at his duster. His breath came in slow clouds, eyes scanning the timberline. A trap? It had to be. No one left a girl like that out in the open, unless they wanted someone to find terror, unless they didn't care who did. He reached for the rifle slowly, but didn't raise it. He waited. Then, the girl moaned barely a sound, more breath than voice. Her body shifted a fraction in the air, enough to tilt her weight painfully against the rope. It dug into her wrists. She didn't cry out again. She just hung there, waiting for judgment. Something twisted in his gut. John was not a man who rushed to act. That had kept him alive through war, through winter, through grief. He wasn't foolish. He had lived alone long enough to know the cost of a wrong step. But as he looked at the girl Apache, by the braids, the dress, the beadwork now dulled by icy, also remembered what it meant to see a body left to freeze. He'd seen enough of that. Too much. With slow steps, he approached. She didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't resist. Her skin was chapped raw at the wrists, and her breath came shallow. The hem of her dress was torn and stiff with blood. No boots, no coat, just a ceremonial buckskin gown, ragged now, clinging to her like a skin shed too late. John crouched beneath the branch, pulled his knife from the sheath at his belt, and cut the rope in 2 swift motions. Her body collapsed into his arms like a fallen bird. She weighed less than she should have. Her arms stayed limp at her sides. She was unconscious now. John didn't speak. He looked around once more into the trees, into the white silence, and then he shifted her in his arms and started back toward the cabin. It was still a mile away, tucked between the foothills and an iced-over creek. The mule followed behind, nose low, breath thick. As he walked, the wind picked up, carrying a sound across the snow. Not a voice, not a howl, just the long, low groan of trees shifting under ice. But to John, it might as well have been a warning. He didn't care. He tightened his grip on her and kept moving. The fire was low but alive when John pushed the cabin door open with his boot. He stepped inside with the girl cradled in his arms, kicking the snow from his heels. Warmth met them in a slow wave, the thick scent of smoke, boiled beans, and pine sap from the firewood stacked tight beside the hearth. He laid her down gently on the wool rug closest to the flames. The room was small, just a table, a shelf, and the single cot he'd slept in alone for years, but it held heat, and that was what mattered now. He moved quickly, pulled the heavy Hudson Bay blanket from the cot, and wrapped it around her, careful not to jostle her arms. Her skin was cold enough to burn. She didn't stir. John took off his gloves, poured water from the kettle into a tin mug, added a dash of salt and a spoonful of the honey he'd rationed all winter. He brought it to her lips, tilted her chin. "Drink," he said, more command than comfort. At first, nothing. Then, her eyes fluttered opendark, slow, searching. She looked at him, then the fire, Then the ceiling logs. She didn't speak. He set the cup aside and leaned closer, checking her feet. Red, swollen, but not black yet. He rubbed warmth into them gently with a cloth and a basin of water, working the circulation back bit by bit. He noticed then that her dress, what was left of it, was ceremonial, not a hunter's garb, not settler's hand-me-downs. This had been something sacred once. He didn't say anything about it. She watched him with a flat gaze, eyes wide but dulled by exhaustion. Suspicion flickered, but it was faint. Her voice, when it came, was low and hoarse. "You live alone?" John didn't answer. She shifted slightly, trying to sit up, but winced. "You're safe here," he said simply, placing the mug into her hands. She held it with trembling fingers, sipped slow. "My name is Tala," she said, after a pause. "You don't have to tell me yours." "John," he replied after a beat. She gave a single nod. Then she said nothing more. Hours passed. The snow thickened against the windows, piling along the sill. The wind moaned through the cracks, but the fire didn't falter. John fed it wood every hour. He said little, watched more. By evening, Tala had shifted closer to the flames. Still wrapped in the blanket, she leaned on one elbow now. Stronger, but quiet. Her movements were deliberate, but tired. She hadn't asked for more than water. She hadn't cried. "You were left there to die," John said softly, not a question. She didn't deny it. "My people cast me out," she said, voice steady. "Said I was cursed." He frowned. "Why?" "No, child. I was chosen for ceremony, but nothing came." Her voice didn't break. She wasn't asking for pity. She was telling a truth, sharp, final. John looked away, toward the rifle on the wall. The silence stretched between them. "You don't strike me as cursed," he said finally. She didn't reply, just looked back at the fire. Later, he unrolled a second quilt and laid it on the floor near the hearth. He didn't ask if she wanted the cot. That felt like too much, too fast. She moved to the bedding on her own, limping slightly, jaw clenched but silent. Just before lying down, she glanced toward him. "You've lost something too," she said. Not a question, a statement. John met her eyes. He nodded once. Outside, the wind howled across the ridge. But inside, for the first time in many winters, there were two sets of breaths in the dark. And for John, that meant something had already changed. Before we dive into everything, let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Connecting with viewers from all across the world has been a huge source of inspiration for us. When John stepped outside the next morning, the snow was waist-deep, sculpted by the wind into uneven drifts. The fence posts were nearly swallowed, and the trail to the barn had vanished under a silver-white crust. He exhaled, watching his breath cloud and scatter, then grabbed the shovel from where it leaned against the porch rail. The cold bit through his gloves, but he worked steadily, shoulders hunched. The air was still, not calm, just holding its breath. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, and the smell of ash and beans lingered. Tala stirred in the corner near the hearth. Her body ached, legs stiff. Feet still tender, but warmth had returned to her bones. She blinked up at the roof beams, unfamiliar, rough-hewn. For a long time, she didn't move, just breathed. There was no pain worse than the one that came after survival. She sat up slowly, wrapping the wool blanket tighter around her. Her toes prickled dull at first, then sharp as life returned. She winced, but welcomed it. Pain meant blood still moved. The sound of boots on the porch pulled her attention to the door. When John entered, shoulders dusted with frost, she was standing beside the stove, holding onto the table for balance. "You should have waited," he said, brushing snow from his coat. "I'm not helpless," she replied, not looking at him. He didn't argue, just pulled off his gloves and nodded toward the pot still resting above the coals. "Sit. I'll ladle." They ate in silence again, but it wasn't the same silence. Not sharp, not uncertain, just quiet, shaped by two people used to it. Midway through the meal, John broke the stillness. "Where were you trying to go?" Tala didn't answer right away. She chewed slowly, swallowed. "I wasn't," she said finally. He frowned. So what then? I just walked, his brow furrowed. Into a storm. No food, no boots. Her eyes met his. Calm. I wasn't supposed to live. The words sat between them, heavy and without drama. She said it like someone who'd accepted it long ago. John looked down at his cup, then back at her. Well, you did. I know. He stood to clear the bowls, placing them in the basin by the door. You can stay, he said after a moment, until the weather breaks. She didn't thank him, just nodded once. He didn't expect gratitude. What mattered was that she didn't argue, that she understood survival wasn't always about running. Sometimes it was about stopping in the right place. Later that afternoon, he brought in fresh kindling and set it beside the hearth. She helped without being asked, her movements slow but deliberate. When she reached for the water bucket and nearly spilled it, he took it from her hands. You don't have to prove anything. I'm not proving, she said softly. I'm choosing. That stopped him. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded, almost to himself. All right, he said. Then let's get through this storm together. The next day, the wind eased, but the cold remained. Hard and unmoving. The fire needed feeding every hour, and the cabin creaked under the weight of snow settling on the roof. John sat at the table sharpening his skinning knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. Tala sat near the hearth, her feet wrapped in wool, her shoulders hunched under his old flannel. She hadn't asked for it, but she wore it now as if it had always belonged to her. Her braid lay over her shoulder, dark against the faded fabric, frayed, tangled, a remnant of something ceremonial turned to burden. Do you have another knife? She asked quietly. John paused mid-stroke, looked up. What for? She touched the end of her braid, fingers lingering. It's too long, and it carries things I don't want. He set the knife down and pulled a smaller blade from a drawer. Clean, balanced. He held it out without speaking. Tala took it gently, cradled it like something sacred. She didn't move to the mirror, there wasn't one. She simply sat cross-legged by the fire and began to cut. Each motion was careful, measured. No hesitation. The thick black braid dropped onto the rug beside her, like the shedding of a second skin. John didn't watch the whole thing, but he noticed the way she breathed after the way her shoulders lowered, not in defeat, but release. He stood, took the braid without a word, and stepped outside. He didn't ask what she wanted done with it. He buried it beneath the snow, at the base of the pine behind the cabin, same place he'd buried his last dog, the same earth that had held everything he couldn't carry indoors. When he returned, she was standing, hands pressed to her temples, as if finding new balance. It's quieter now, she said. He didn't ask if she meant inside her or in the room. He just nodded. That evening, as he salted meat for preservation, she peeled potatoes beside him. Her movements were slow but skilled, no wasted motion, no fear of the blade. John glanced sideways. You've done this before. Cooking? Number. This kind of work. Camp work. Winter prep. Tala gave a small smile, almost invisible. I wasn't a wife kept in ceremony. I built fires, scraped hides, packed traps. They needed wives who could endure, just not ones who questioned. He didn't press, but he saw her differently now, not just a survivor, but someone shaped by labor, expectation, disappointment. Did your people know the truth? He asked after a while. About why you couldn't bear children. Tala was quiet for a long moment. Then, it wasn't me. John looked up. He was older than my father, she said. Chosen for title, not for strength. I was. Presented. But they couldn't let the people suspect him, so they blamed me. John sat back slowly. You knew for sure? She nodded once. I lost a child once. Before him, I was 15. It wasn't public. It wasn't allowed. But I knew. She wasn't ashamed. Not anymore. And when my cycle returned again 2 moons ago, I knew my body still carried life. But by then, they'd already cast me out. The fire popped. John said nothing. But he stood, went to the shelf, and pulled down a bundle of old wool socks. He set them beside her on the table. For your feet. Ugh. Tala looked at them, then at him. It was the first time he saw her eyes soften. "Thank you," she said. Not like a formality, like a vow. 3 days passed, and the snow settled into silence. The wind still whispered through the pines, but it no longer screamed. The icicles hanging from the eaves had thickened into glass-like blades. Inside the cabin, things moved with quiet rhythm. Tala had begun rising before John, stoking the fire, boiling water, checking the buckets. She never asked permission. She didn't need to. John noticed her limp had lessened. She moved slower than most, but with purpose. When she folded blankets, she did so like someone taught by repetition, not convenience. When she handled the kitchen knife, it wasn't with delicacy, but certainty. A woman used to survival, not protection. One morning, as John split wood near the tree line, he paused. There it was again, a thin curl of smoke distant, just past the ridge. It could have been a settler, a trapper. But something in it was wrong. It rose too slow, too deliberate, not from a hearth, but from a campfire shielded by intent. He watched it for a long while, eyes narrowed, breath still. He returned to the cabin without speaking. Tala noticed the tension in his jaw. "What did you see?" "Smoke." She froze. Just for a second. Her hands clenched on the edge of the table. "They found me." He didn't ask who they were. "Not yet." "Was anyone with you when they cast you out?" "No one." She swallowed. "But they don't always need eyes. The snow remembers footprints." John set his rifle across the table. "You sure they'd come all this way for you?" Tala looked him dead in the eye. "If they think I'll speak, yes." "About the child?" She nodded. "About everything." He paced once, looked toward the window. He didn't like being watched, even less from behind trees. "Then we set watches. I can help." Not yet," he said. "Your feet still bleed. I can still see." There was something in her voice steel wrapped in exhaustion. A woman who knew the cost of silence and wasn't ready to pay it again. That night, John sat outside with the rifle laid across his lap. The stars glimmered overhead, crisp and sharp. He watched the tree line, listened. He thought about Holbrook, about how far they'd come, about how far someone might travel if they believed a secret could unseat power. Inside, Tala didn't sleep. She sat near the fire, running a comb through her shortened hair, not for beauty, but for readiness. She watched the door, always half waiting for it to open. By dawn, nothing had stirred, but the smoke had moved farther along the ridge now, as if tracing a path around them. A slow, deliberate circle. John came in, face tight. "They're scouting," he said. Tala didn't flinch. "Then they'll come." He nodded, and said the only thing that mattered. "Let them." The next storm came in low and slow, not with fury but with weight. The air thickened, and frost gathered on the cabin windows by midday. John added another log to the fire, then pulled up the rug near the hearth. Beneath it, a trap door groaned open, revealing a shallow storage pit lined with cedar planks. Inside, salted meat, canvas bags of beans, and something wrapped carefully in oilskin. He lifted it with deliberate hands. Tala, who had been mending the hem of her flannel wrap by the window, turned slightly. "What's that?" John didn't answer right away. He unwrapped the bundle at the table. Inside were a few items. A folded cavalry map from the old campaign routes west of the San Carlos Reservation, a weathered pouch, and a small wooden box bound with twine. "My wife's," he said quietly. Before she passed, Tala stood, walked slowly to the table. "You served?" John nodded. "After the war, they sent us out west. Said we were peacekeepers, but we were just another line of boots." He opened the box. Inside was a plain silver ring, dull with age, and a tiny wooden carving of a pine tree. "She gave me this when we settled here. Said if I ever made it back from what we saw out there, I'd need something to plant myself in, something that didn't move." Tala looked down at the ring, but said nothing. She understood that kind of grief. The kind that didn't shout, just stayed. "She died in Holbrook," John said, voice steady. "Fever, same season my boy caught it. He didn't last the week." There was a silence between them then. Not uncomfortable, just complete. Tala rested her hand lightly on the edge of the table. You buried them there? Number. His voice lowered. The town doctor did. I didn't go back. She nodded once. That's why you built this place. I needed a land that didn't speak. Tala understood. She'd lived in silence too long not to. She touched the carving of the pine tree gently. This reminds me of something my mother gave me. A sash, woven red. She said it was the color of our people's strength. Her voice faltered. When they cast me out, she didn't stop it. But she cried. Couldn't protect you? No, she whispered. But she remembered me. They stood quietly, the fire crackling behind them. You ever want to send her word? John asked. Tala hesitated. I'm not supposed to exist anymore. John took the oilskin pouch from the table and tucked the ring and carving back inside. That don't mean you can't be found. He placed the bundle gently back into the pit and closed the trapdoor. That evening, the wind picked up again, not screaming but constant like breath drawn and never released. Tala stood by the window, eyes scanning the dark ridge beyond the trees. John lit the lamp but kept it low. He pulled his coat from the peg and checked the rifle near the door. Then Tala spoke, voice barely audible over the crackling fire. If I had a child again, I wouldn't want it born under ceremony. John turned. I'd want it to come into this world free. No altar, no burden, just life. He didn't say anything, but he nodded, and that was enough. By the fifth morning, the air had changed. Not warmer, no. The cold still sank into the bones, but quieter, more precise, as if even the wind was watching. John noticed it when the axe didn't bite as deep, when the barn door resisted less, and when the birds long silent fluttered once from the pines like breath held too long. Signs of shifting weather, or a shifting threat. Inside, Tala moved with more strength. Her limp was still present, but her steps were sure. She folded bedding, peeled potatoes, tended the stove. She didn't ask where things belonged. She simply found her place. That afternoon, while John was patching a hinge on the coop, he saw it. A footprint, just one, half hidden beneath wind-swept snow, near the edge of the chicken yard. Not his, not hers. Deep, booted. He followed it to the tree line, then it vanished. When he came back inside, Tala looked up and knew before he spoke. They were here. John nodded, not close, just watching. Tala sat down slowly, her fingers closing over the edge of her cup. They don't knock, they wait, and when they know no one's coming to stop them, they finish it. John pulled his coat from the peg and laid it beside the door. His rifle leaned just next to it. He didn't say he'd keep watch. She already knew. Was it always like that? He asked. She shook her head. Once, there were rules, elders, boundaries, but the ones who lead now, her voice dropped. They bend fear into ceremony and call it tradition. He stared into the fire for a long time. I saw that during the war, he said quietly. Men who called cruelty discipline and made peace a threat. Tala didn't speak, but her eyes met his. We're not going to let them finish it, he said. She hesitated, then stood. Walked to the shelf, where the flannel wraps were folded, and opened the small drawer beneath. From within, she pulled a piece of carved antler, smoothed and shaped into a kind of pendant. Simple, old. This was from before, she said. From my first love. I kept it hidden even when they cleansed my quarters. They would have burned it. She pressed it into John's hand. I want you to hide it here. He didn't ask why. He lifted the trapdoor again and laid it next to his wife's pine carving. Two remnants, two pasts, preserved without altar, without explanation. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the porch with the rifle across his knees, watching the dark, listening for the snap of brush or the echo of breath. But the only sound was the sigh of wind across snow and the soft moan of trees too burdened to creak. Just before dawn, Tala stepped out beside him, wrapped in her quilt, feet bare against the boards. You don't have to keep watch alone. I do. She didn't argue, but she sat next to him anyway, watching the first hints of light bleed behind the ridge. Thank you, she said. He turned slightly. For what? For not pretending I'm temporary. John's voice came low. You're not. It happened on the seventh morning. The wind had stilled. The sky hung low and pale, with a silence that came not from peace, but from anticipation. John stepped outside just after first light, eyes narrowing toward the ridge. They were there, 3 of them, not close, but not hidden. On horseback, sitting still, like carved silhouettes against the pale timber. No colors, no flags, no gestures, just watching. John didn't raise a weapon. He didn't wave. He just looked back until they turned their horses and rode along the ridge, moving westward. Not away, just circling. When he returned to the cabin, he dusted snow from his shoulders, kicked the door shut, and leaned the rifle against the wall. "They're here," he said. Tala stood by the stove, not surprised. "3?" He nodded. "For now." She set the kettle down gently, her hands steady. "They won't act yet." "No," John said. "They want to see if we're afraid." Tala looked at him carefully. "Are you?" He thought a moment. "Number." He crossed the room, opened the chest near the cot. Inside were traps, cord, flint, a second pistol, and a leather holster worn by time. He pulled it out slowly, held it in his hands, then fastened it around his waist. It fit like memory tight in all the right places, familiar in ways he didn't want to admit. Tala watched. "You haven't worn that since her." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Later that day, he and Tala worked together in silence. They boarded the windows of the barn, moved supplies into the root cellar, checked the hidden exit behind the coop. It wasn't panicit, was preparation. The kind that came from people who'd lived through enough to know hope didn't mean foolishness. At dusk, John returned from setting a trap line near the slope and found Tala seated near the fire, sharpening a bone knife. "Not new. Not from here. I kept it from ceremony," she said, noticing his eyes. "They meant it to cut animal skin. I meant it to cut ropes." John didn't ask how many times she'd thought about using it. He didn't want to know. He sat across from her. "They'll come tomorrow," he said. She nodded. "They always act on the 8th day." "Why?" "Because it was the number chosen by the old ones. 8 is the cycle of rebirth. So they believe ending something on that day returns it to the soil clean." He grimaced. "What they're doing isn't clean." "No," she said. "It's fear, dressed in history." The fire popped softly. Then she looked at him, eyes clear. "If they ask you to hand me over, what will you do?" John didn't hesitate. "I won't, even if they offer safe passage?" "They won't," he said. "And if they did, I still wouldn't." She studied his face, then turned her gaze to the fire. "There's no ritual older than mercy," she said quietly. He nodded, and outside, in the hush of pine and snow, the wind did not answer. But it would. Soon, by sunrise, the trees no longer stood silent. Crows gathered along the ridge, black dots against the snow, shifting restlessly. The cold felt sharper that morning, not because of the temperature, but because of the weight in the Ira, waiting kind of cold, like the pause between thunder and lightning. John stood at the edge of the porch, coat buttoned tight, rifle slung across his shoulder. He watched as the men appeared again, closer this time. 4 now, not 3. They didn't hide. They came slow, horses picking careful steps across the crusted snow, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats. One wore a red sash around his waist. Not Apache standard, but a symbol. John had seen it before decades ago, a man whose voice carried the power of exile. A war chief turned seer, a self-proclaimed guardian of the bloodline. Not recognized by elders, but feared enough to be followed. Tala stood beside John, arms folded tightly over her chest. "That's him," she whispered. "Goya." John didn't ask how she knew. It was in her voice and the way it dropped like a stone through still water. The men stopped 30 paces from the porch. Goya raised one hand, palm out not in greeting, but command. John didn't move. "You have something that belongs to the people," Goya called, voice calm but cold. "Send her out." John didn't answer. He could feel Tala's stillness beside him, not fear resolve. "She's no longer under your word," John said flatly. Goya's smile barely touched his face. "She was never under mine. She was given by council." "To be cast out?" John's voice didn't rise. "To freeze?" To preserve our future, Goya replied. What was unclean had to be removed. She's not unclean. She's not yours to name, Goya snapped. John's fingers curled around the stock of his rifle. She is now. The silence that followed was colder than the wind. Goya didn't argue further. He dismounted, slow and deliberate, and walked forward 5 steps. The others stayed behind, motionless as shadows. You cannot protect her from what she is, he said. The girl bears witness to shame. She threatens our power. Tala stepped forward then, off the porch, onto the snow. Her voice was clear. I threaten your lies. Goya's eyes flared. You've chosen Exili. No, she said. I was cast out, but I choose this. She turned slightly just enough for her shoulder to brush John's precedes. I choose to be free. Goya's hand twitched toward his belt. John raised the rifle slightly. Don't, he warned. For a breath, the whole forest held still. Then Goya lowered his hand. This isn't over, he said. I know, Tala answered. And with that, the 4 men turned, walked back to their horses, mounted, and disappeared once more into the ridge. John didn't lower the rifle until they were gone from sight. Tala looked up at him. They'll come again, he nodded. Then we'll be ready. She stepped closer, her breath visible in the air between them. I'm not afraid anymore, she said. John's voice was soft. Neither am I. Behind them, the fire burned steady. And for the first time since it began, the circle they both feared had closed. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. Snow fell again that night. Not heavy, not harsh, but soft, like ash drifting from a distant fire. It layered the earth in silence, covering every footprint, every trace of where they'd stood. The world had grown still, as if holding breath before the storm broke fully. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low. John sat at the table, sharpening the same knife he'd carried through 2 wars. Not because it was dull, but because it kept his hands busy. His eyes, though, remained on the window, on the darkness beyond. Tala moved with quiet purpose. She rolled wool blankets tight, packed jars of lard, beans, dried corn into sacks. If they needed to run, it had to be fast. If they needed to stay, it had to be smart. No one had said the words aloud, but both knew. The next time Goya came, he wouldn't leave without blood. As she folded the last of the cloths, Tala paused. There's a story, she said softly, from my mother's side, about a woman who survived the long walk, even after her family was taken. John looked up. She carried a clay doll in her sash, Tala continued. Every night she would whisper her grief into it, every fear, every name she missed. She'd bury it in the morning and make another. He waited. One night she buried the last doll, but whispered nothing. She said her heart had already found its new shape. Tala turned to him. I think I understand that now. John didn't respond right away. He stood, crossed to the shelf above the stove, and pulled down a small tin. Inside, a locket, brass, unpolished. He held it out to her. My wife wore this, he said. When she died, I kept it buried under the first fence post I laid. First thing I ever built here. Tala took it gently, ran her thumb across the worn engraving. A tree, simple, familiar. I think she'd want you to have it, John added. Tala didn't cry. She just closed her fingers around it and nodded. Outside, the night stretched longer than it should have. Later, John stood by the barn, watching the tree line under moonlight. He heard an owl call once. Then, nothing. No hoofbeats, no voices, no wind. Still, his grip tightened on the rifle. Somewhere out there, Goya's men waited. Not to talk, to finish what they'd begun years ago. Not just exile, but erasure. Inside, Tala lit a second lamp. Not because she feared the dark, but because she refused to be hidden anymore. She sat near the fire, her back straight, her face calm. She whispered once in her language, then folded her hands in her lap and waited. The quiet wasn't peace. It was preparation, and it wouldn't last. By mid-morning, the sun broke through the cloud sweep, but clear. The snow gleamed like glass. and the forest stood sharp and bare, every tree branch etched in ice. John stepped outside early, shovel in hand, and began to clear a long trench from the barn to the front of the cabin. It wasn't for walking. It was to make his line clear. He scraped the snow until it hit frozen dirt, wide enough for a horse, narrow enough to signal intent. Inside, Tala watched him through the window, her hands resting on the windowsill like folded wings. She didn't stop him. She didn't call out. This was his language measured, stark, and carved into the earth. When he returned, his cheeks red from wind, his jaw stiff, he found her sitting at the table. She had a sheet of buckskin spread flat and a small jar of charcoal ground from the fire. With her fingertip, she drew quick, clean Lanessa map from memory. "They're circling from the west," she said, "but they won't come through the low creek. The banks are frozen sharp, and horses can't move well there." John nodded. "Then they'll try the north flank. Over the stone rise." She tapped the spot he meant. "That's where we lay the markers." He looked at her, really looked. Gone was the girl from the tree, shivering and bound. What sat across from him now was something older than her years, something returned from fire, but still burning. "Are you sure?" he asked. "You don't have to face them." Tala shook her head. "They were willing to bury me. If I don't stand now, I'm letting them finish." John didn't argue. He understood what it meant to be cornered by silence and what it took to break from it. Together, they packed what little they could carry in case retreat became necessity, but neither planned to run. That evening, John laid his traps along the northern rise. Nothing lethal, just enough to delay. Tala set mirrored shards between trees, angled to catch light and scatter movement tricks passed from generations too often hunted to survive by chance. They worked until dusk, their breaths rising in rhythm, their shadows stretching long across the snow. Before retreating inside, John paused. Then he knelt. With the back of his glove, he drew a single cross into the snow near the porch step. Simple, crooked, honest. Tala stood behind him, watching. She didn't kneel, but she bowed her head. "Do you think he's watching?" she asked softly. John stood, his gaze rising to the graying sky. "I think he never looked away." They entered the cabin together. The lamps were lit. The rifle was cleaned. The kettle boiled steady. Outside, the line in the snow stayed sharp. A boundary, a warning, a covenant. They came at twilight. No drums, no warning. Just the dull crunch of hooves through snow and the creak of worn saddles pushing through the pines. John heard them before he saw them four riders, cloaked and hunched, moving in formation from the north rise, exactly where Tala had marked. From inside the cabin, she watched through a slit between the boards. Her breath fogged the glass, but her hand stayed steady on the bone-handled knife. "They're testing," she whispered. John nodded. "Seeing if we'll fire first." He didn't. Not yet. Instead, he stepped outside, slow and deliberate. The rifle hung across his shoulder, not pointed, not hidden, just there. The lead rider stopped 20 yards from the porch. He dismounted with a kind of ritual to it, slow, methodical, like every movement was meant to intimidate. The red sash was gone, replaced with a coat stitched in old army canvas and Apache beadwork, both frayed with time, a relic of stolen pride. "Goya." He stepped forward, alone. The others stayed mounted, their silhouettes blurred by distance and dusk. "I gave you days," Goya said. Out of respect, John's voice was gravel. "You don't respect anything. Not her. Not what you were." Goya smiled coldly. "You think this is about vengeance? I think it's about fear." A muscle jumped in Goya's jaw. "You speak like a man who's forgotten his place," he said. John stepped down off the porch, boots crunching snow. "I buried everything that made me kneel. War, shame, even my own name. Once." He stopped at the line he'd carved. "But I remember where I stand." The two men faced each other across that narrow trench of earth and frost. Then, behind Goya, one of the mounted men made a sound sharp, like a whistle. Not a warning, a signal. Before John could react, an arrow sliced past him, thunked into the cabin wall. Tala didn't scream, didn't flinch. She threw the window open and fired. The shot cracked like thunder, echoing off the hills. One rider dropped from his horsehard, unmoving. The others wheeled back, spurred their mounts. Goya didn't flinch, didn't run. He stepped back slowly, eyes burning into John's. "You just made her a target," he said. John didn't blink. "She always was." Goya mounted again. "Tomorrow ends this." He turned his horse, galloped back into the trees. The hoofbeats faded like falling drums. John exhaled, slow and steady, then turned to the cabin. Tala stood in the open window, smoke still curling from the barrel of the revolver. He nodded once. She nodded back, and for the first time in years, John Merritt smiled. Night fell heavy. The wind returned with it not in gusts, but in slow, sweeping breaths, bending pine limbs like watchers whispering secrets to one another. Inside the cabin, John packed fresh cartridges into a canvas pouch while Tala sat on the floor, tending to a bundle wrapped in cloth. It was the doll, not made of clay, but of leather, cedar, and ash. Symbolic, quiet. She wasn't weaving grief into it, she was preparing memory. One last gift, should the night take her. "You don't have to go out there," John said. "I do. You've done enough." She looked up at him. "And if I stop now, they'll call my silence proof. Let them call my voice the fire." John said nothing, but when he passed her the loaded rifle, his hands were gentle. At dawn, they took positions, John on the ridge above the barn, Tala behind the stable wall, with a clean line of sight toward the northern trees. The riders came again. This time there were 6. Not a raid, a reckoning. They dismounted 30 paces from the fence line, weapons unslung but not raised. Goya stepped forward, his coat open, showing a sash of black across his chest, mourning, but not for her. For power threatened, for control unraveling. "I offer one final mercy," he called. "Return her to judgment. We will forget your rebellion." John didn't respond. Tala stepped from the stable, rifle in hand, hair braided tight. "I'm not yours to trade," she said. Goya's eyes narrowed. "Then you choose your death." "No," she said. "I choose truth." She tossed the doll forward. It landed in the snow between them, the ash inside spilling out black against white. "This is the record of what was done to me," she said. "It carries the silence I bore, and the voices you silenced." One of the younger riders shifted, unsettled. Goya snarled. "These are children's tales." John spoke now, voice calm. "Then why fear them?" Goya raised his hand. Fire. Gunshots exploded across the clearing. Snow kicked up. A window shattered. John rolled behind the barn, returning fire with precise rhythm 2 shots. Then, silence. He clipped one rider's shoulder, sent him tumbling. Tala dropped to one knee, exhaled and struck another. But the attackers closed in. One made it to the porch. John met him head-on, rifle swinging hard. The man fell backward into the snow, stunned. More movement from the rear. John spun, out of cartridges. Just then, a shot rang out from behind. Tala. She stood, breathing hard, the rifle shaking in her hands, but steady. Silence fell again. 3 bodies lay motionless. The rest fled. Goya was not among them. He had vanished. John lowered his weapon. Tala collapsed to her knees, not from pain, from release. Snow soaked with blood doesn't melt quickly. It crusts, darkens, sinks. John moved among the fallen in silence. He checked each one. 2 were gone. 1 groaned, barely breathing. A boy, no older than 17, shot through the shoulder, legs trembling beneath him. John knelt beside him, not as a soldier, but as a man who'd once been this broken. "Where's Goya?" he asked. The boy shook his head. "Gone. Before the shots." Tala stood behind them, watching. The rifle still hung at her side, but she no longer held it like a weapon, more like a weight. John looked back at her. "We leave him?" She nodded. Mercy, she knew, sometimes cost more than vengeance. They brought the boy into the barn. John cleaned the wound while Tala boiled water. The boy winced, cried out once but didn't plead. "You know who I am?" Tala asked, kneeling beside him. The boy looked at her, shame and wonder mixing in his bloodshot eyes. "You were the ghost they warned us about," he whispered. She didn't smile. I was never a ghost. I was the truth. The boy blinked. Why didn't you kill me? She paused, then said simply, because that would have made me like them. Later, after the barn was closed and the injured boy slept, John and Tala sat on the cabin steps. The cold was biting, but they didn't move. I've killed men before, she said, defending myself. Others. John nodded. So have I. This felt different. It always does when you survive something you were meant to disappear into. They sat in quiet, listening to the slow rise of the wind through the pine tops. John leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Goyal come back. I know, Tala said. Next time, he won't offer words. Next time, I won't need them. A long silence stretched between them. Then John said, almost to the wind, you think God forgives the things we didn't stop? Tala looked toward the darkening sky. I think he sees the fire we walked through, and that we're still walking. She placed a hand gently on his, not claiming, not asking, just there, and John didn't pull away, because mercy hadn't made them weak, it had made them seen. The ridge burned at sunrise, not with fire, but with light, golden, fierce, and pure, the kind of light that stripped shadows from trees and thawed even the hardest frost. Tala stood at the cabin's edge, wrapped in John's old coat, her hair unbound, her eyes fixed on the horizon. John stood beside her, rifle slung, but untouched. No riders came. No drums. No shouts. Only silence and light. She whispered a prayer in her language. Not for protection. Not for deliverance. For gratitude. Because she'd lived. Behind them, the wounded boy still slept, his breathing steady, cradled in the scent of cedar and wool. When he woke, they'd send him back with a letter signed by both, marked with charcoal and the carving of a pine. A message not of threat, but of witness. Let the people know. Tala, the forgotten wife, the cast-out woman, had stood, and had not fallen. She turned to John, eyes clear, but not soft. What will you do? She asked. Rebuild, he said. The barn's a mess. She smiled. I meant after that. John looked out toward the ridge, toward Holbrook, toward the land he hadn't returned to since burying his family in pieces of wood and memory. I think it's time I reclaimed my name, he said. She nodded. I think I will, too. He looked at her. You have one picked? She held up the locket he'd given her, one from his wife, now resting against her chest. I think it's time I carried more than survival. They didn't speak for a long time after that. They just watched as the sun climbed higher, casting gold on every path once crossed by fear. Not everything was finished. Goya still breathed somewhere beyond the ridge. But Tala no longer ran from him, and John no longer ran from himself. There would be time for more fire, more justice, if the world demanded it. But for now, there was mercy, there was light, and there was life. But for now, there was mercy, there was light, and there was life. And in that silence after survival, something new had begun to take root. Snow melted slowly in the days that followed, not from warmth but from time. The kind that doesn't rush healing, only reveals what was buried beneath. The cabin held the scent of ash and pine. Tala sat by the hearth, mending a sleeve with deliberate stitches. Not out of necessity she had newer coats, but because the act itself gave her breath, rhythm, purpose. John moved outside, tending to the woodpile. The barn still bore scars from the fight-splintered beams, a broken latch, but the animals had returned to calm. The world, somehow, had not ended. And yet, everything had changed. Inside, the boy sat on the cot, his arms still wrapped in linen. He hadn't spoken much since the attack, but he watched Tala with a gaze that carried apology and something more difficult recognition. You really were the one they feared, he said quietly. Tala didn't look up from her stitching. No, she replied. They feared what I remembered. The boy frowned. Why keep remembering? Tala met his eyes then, steady, because memory is what keeps truth alive, and truth, even buried, always finds air. John returned with an armful of chopped wood and paused at the door, listening. She taught me something, the boy added, eyes drifting toward the locket around her neck. That truth isn't always clean, but it's the only thing that survives fire. John glanced at Tala, but didn't speak. She simply nodded once. That evening, they packed a small satchel for the boys' supplies, flint, a note. John handed him the pine carving from the hidden box. He hesitated. He'd understand, John said. Some things are meant to go forward. The boy took it with both hands. He left before first light, walking east not back to Goya, but toward his own reckoning. Tala watched him go until he disappeared beyond the ridge. Will they believe him? John asked. Some, she said. Enough. They stood there for a while, shoulder to shoulder, without touching. Then Tala broke the stillness. Do you think they'll ever stop coming? John didn't answer right away. No, he said at last. But I think we'll stop hiding. She smiled faintly, and beneath their boots, the thawed earth whispered softly of spring. Spring did not arrive in full bloom. It crept in slow, unsure like a creature wounded too many times. But it came all the same. The last snow melted beneath the tall pines. Green pushed up from places once scorched. Birds returned, in pairs and in song. John stood near the cabin fence one morning, watching the hills breathe again. He was whittling a piece of oak, the shape still rough, but the form familiar a tree, bending into wind. Tala came out carrying a new quilt. She laid it over the porch rail, letting the breeze work through it. The colors were boldreds, deep earth brown, pale gold. Apache patterns, stitched in silence over many nights. She caught him watching. It's not for show, she said. I didn't think it was, he replied. She leaned against the post beside him. I've been thinking of a name. For what? This place, this life, us. John said nothing, just kept carving. When they cast me out, she continued, they took my name from the roll, but they couldn't take it from my breath. She looked toward the mountains. In my tongue, Tahane means what remains after the burning. It's what my mother whispered to me when I was born too early, and the fire nearly took her. John's hands paused. That's a good name, he said softly. Tala turned to him. And you? You still carry hers. He looked down at the carving. I carry what she gave me, but it doesn't bind me. She reached out and touched the locket resting on her chest. Then let's give this place both our names. John nodded. Together, they drove 2 cedar stakes into the edge of the trail. Between them, they hung the quilt knot as a banner, but a declaration. This place had seen exile, fear, fire. Now, it would see grace. Inside the cabin, the walls bore signs of new life bundles of dried sage, carved tokens, her medicine bag hanging beside his old Union hat. 2 stories. Woven. Named. Years passed. The trails grew deeper, the trees taller, and the faces around the valley slowly changed. But the cabin Tahane stood still, not untouched, but unchanged in its truth. John grew gray in the beard first, then the eyes. Tala never counted the lines on her hands, only the seeds they planted each spring, each harvest, a quiet testimony to what love could outlast. Sometimes, writers still passed through. Sometimes they asked if the stories were true, about the woman who was cast out and stood her ground, about the man who'd lost everything and found something sacred in the ashes, about how mercy once drew a line in the snow and held. John never gave them the full tale. He'd nod toward the old ridge and say, "The land remembers more than I ever could," and they would ride on, leaving with more than they brought. Tala, now called Tahane by some and Mother by others, kept a journal by the fire. In it, she didn't write revenge. She wrote names. The ones forgotten, the ones reclaimed. She always said memory was holy ground. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch together, watching the sun fall through the pines, drinking coffee too bitter and laughing at stories too worn. And when the wind stirred just right, it carried voices, not ghosts, but echoes, of what was survived, of what had been made new. Because the truest stories of the Wild West aren't just in the shootouts or dust trails, they're in the hearts that kept beating after the silence, in the hands that reached across exile, in the fires that refused to destroy. If this story found something in you, something quiet, something true, then let it live a little longer. Share it. And remember, not all legends come with a horse and gun. Some come with grace, and two names carved into cedar, where mercy made its home. This is one of many forgotten true Wild West stories where grit met grace. If it stirred a memory or lit a little hope, consider sharing it. The frontier lives on in every heart that still remembers.